And welcome back, fans and friends, teammates, classmates, one and all. It's good to be back with you again today. We are still Management 573, this time week 3, project life cycles and starting the project, or as a project manager would refer to it, initiating projects. This is what this week is all about. Some really good reading in the book, so make sure you avail yourself to that. These are the learning objectives for today. I'll let you pause and review those on your own. There are some opening cases. Those are in the book. Those I will leave to you as well. So now, when we're a project manager, one of the very first decisions you're ever going to make is to decide what developmental cycle you want to pursue, right? And the developmental cycle, the developmental approach, how are you going to develop your project along the way, right? This is the ultimate question to start out with, all right? How are you going to do that? And by choosing that, it's going to give you a rhythm and set of activities to flow throughout the project. Now, there are any number of approaches that the PMBOK guide will lay out, and the book does too. Predictive, I have been calling also waterfall. So it goes by two names, just like Agile goes by the name change driven. All right, so change driven. So if I say change driven, I mean Agile. And actually, iterative and incremental are very much like Agile. They're really portions of it, and they're kind of in the middle. So predictive, really, remember I said, is about controlling risk, right? And these are about change, right? And as I said, these two in the middle, iterative and incremental, are really in the middle between predictive or waterfall and agile, change driven. And so what do I mean? Well, in waterfall, I'm going to define the requirements and the cost and the schedule all up front, and it's determined and it's locked in. In iterative, it's still change driven, but the requirements are something I'm going to detail, even though it's change driven. So it's change driven, so it's like agile, but I've defined the requirements, so it's like waterfall. Incremental, similarly, right? So that one I believe is cost. Anyhow, focus on waterfall, focus on agile. That'll get you. But you have to choose which developmental cycle you're going to use because they're very different along the way. So this is iterative and incremental developmental approaches, which, again, these are iterative and incremental are both really forms of agile. They're closer to agile, but they are also in the middle between that and predictive, as we saw on the last slide. Okay? And so really it's about how we detail out schedule and requirements between them. That's all. So once I've chosen the developmental cycle, and I don't want to confuse that with this term, then we can choose the project life cycle, right? So a project life cycle is a series of phases that your project is going to pass through from its beginning, we call initiation, to its closure, right? Or start to completion. And it is going to do this through a series of phases, project phases. Every project will have phases, and they are sequential, they're sequential, they're logical. So phase one of my project life cycle, phase one might be design, right? And when I get to design, at the close of it, I'm going to do a gate check, right? I'm going to check whether I met my objectives of the design phase. If I did, I'm going to go on to the next phase, and we'll call that phase planning phase. When I get to the end of planning phase, I'm going to do a gate check, and if I pass that gate check, I'm going to go on to the next phase. and that phase might be the build phase or execution, right? And when I get to the execution and I've built my deliverable, I'll have a gate check. And if I pass that gate check, if I don't pass it, I'm going to go back through this life cycle again. But if I do pass it, I'll go on to the next phase, which might be transition to operations. And then once I've done transitioning to operations, I'll have a gate check again, and then I will close the project. And those would be my 5 phases in this project. Now, the great thing about project management, what makes it useful worldwide in any industry, because various industries have their own project phases, right? So you can use any set of phases that your company or your industry uses and build project management around it. It fits into any project lifecycle. That's exciting to me. And that's really one of its major advantages. Remember, we said project management is a framework, not a methodology. And that framework can fit into any industry lifecycle. Okay, so here is just their view of life cycles. You can see they were doing the same thing, except I gave them names. They call it iteration 1, iteration 2, iteration 3. Okay, in a predictive project, notice this is why they call it waterfall. During these phases, when I'm done with one, I will go to the next. When I'm done with this, I will go to the next. Never do I go back up. Well, not never. We'll just say, in general, I don't go backwards. I just go in one direction in waterfall, right? But in some sort of incremental or agile approach, I am bouncing all over the place as long as I am producing value. That's supposed to be an A. Value. Value is the key. I have to produce value in my deliverable. Okay. So the only one thing this slide doesn't have that I included was at the end of each phase, you'll do a gate check. That gate check says, have I accomplished my objectives for this phase? If not, I'm going to have to go around again. But if I did, I'm going to go on to the next phase. That's how that's going to work. Now, in the project lifecycle, what's going to happen is at the beginning, every life cycle starts off slow. And that's why you end up with this kind of curve. And in execution, this is where your project is really taking off, right in the middle here, right? And you can see the steep curve on this chart. And at the end of a project, you can see just as slowly as it wrapped up, there's a steep decline to closing your project, right? And that's how projects work. Most of the work is done between the dashed lines along the way. So in project management, around every phase, I am using the process groups, right? And the process groups include planning, initiating, planning, executing, monitoring and controlling, and closing. Those are the process groups. And you'll see that reflected in your book. Okay, so those process groups, what they do is they group together processes that you want to work with together. You're like, as a project manager, you're like, okay, I'm initiating my project. What do? I look in the PMBOK guide or in the current course book, and I look under initiating a project, and it says there are 2 processes I want to implement right away. I want to develop my project charter, and I want to develop my list of stakeholders. That's what you do first. Those 2 processes are how you kick off a project. And that was just in the initiating process group that I was just referring to as an example. So the process groups, there you go. Initiating, planning, executing, monitoring and controlling, and closing. So this is where a project begins. This is where the project manager is actually assigned by the PMO. They'll assign you, because the C-suite now has done their business case and handed it to the PMO. PMO says, great, I have just the project manager for you, and you're assigned, right? And you're going to then look at the process groups and do, at the very beginning, you're going to do those processes that are in this process group, right? And then you'll do planning processes, which leads to a project management plan at the end. You'll execute it, which means you're building it. It is really the deliverable that you're supposed to be making. That's where you're building it. These two actually happen at the same time. While you're building it, you're looking for gaps between the plan and your actual results, your plan data versus your actual data. And if you have a gap, we actually call it a variance. You're actually going to do a change and implement the change back in execution as you build it. You're trying to build it. Remember, what we're building by definition is unique, never been done before. And we're trying to refine it so that someday we'll turn our project over, we're done with it, to operations or to maintenance to use regularly. And we want it to be predictable, okay? And at the end, of course, every project manager closes a project. This is an example of how these process groups work together. Notice that they never, look, initiating, you'd think is just at the beginning, but look, initiating goes on into planning. Notice that the executing process group, which I said is where you're building it, the deliverable. Notice that starts early on, even in initiating. I don't even have a plan yet, but executing has begun, and it continues all the way through closing, right? So these process groups overlap a lot, and monitoring and controlling is very similar. It's a shallower curve, but it's very similar to execution. This is the monitoring and controlling one. It kind of goes up, makes a bubble, and comes back. Very similar, because this is looking for a variance, as I mentioned, variance. And that's, do I have something between my planned data, which I planned here, and when I build it, I'm collecting data. In here, I'm checking, is there a gap? Is there a variance? And if so, I need to go fix it in the process of my build during execution. So they're really happening. We talk about process groups in columns, right? Initiating, planning, executing, controlling, and closing. But they really don't happen in columns. That's just a way to organize it in your mind and to follow certain processes and work with them together. What really is happening is what you see right here. This is really what's going on, how they overlap each other throughout, okay? So the time spent on each. You'll spend very little time on planning. The key thing you're going to do is, you'll do a lot of things, but the key thing you're going to do is build your charter. That's the big thing. In planning, you're going to build your project management plan. In executing, you're going to build it, is the key thing. In monitoring, controlling, you're looking for gaps. And in closing, you will wrap up and do lessons learned. Okay, those are really what's going on. So you notice most of your time is spent building it on the project and planning it. Most of your time is built planning and executing the project along the way. Okay, so characteristics of the process groups. It's going to vary for every project. Remember, the PMBOK guide is giving you a framework. It hasn't given you a methodology. It's going to vary because you have to build your own methodology. If I'm planning a birthday party and I tell my significant other I have $200 tops, that's for food at McDonald's, that's for balloons, that's for presents and gifts for the visitors, right? If that's the case, then I don't really need a budget, right? I just need to stay under that amount. It's pretty simple, but I have to build my methodology that works. Okay, let's take a break and come back.